So, if your children were about to die, or they were in a fight that made it seem as though they were close to dying, you would probably step in. Right? I mean, assuming you had the ability to, it seems like a somewhat obvious decision. I mean, those are my creations. I love them more than anything on earth. I love them so much that the simple idea of them struggling brings me to tears. That level of love would surely guarantee that if they were ever in danger, you would step in to save them. That's just like parenting 101. However, parenting is apparently difficult for divine trees, because that is the exact situation that Jura found himself thrust into in chapter 20, and yet no interference. See, because in chapter 20 of Boruto's 2 Blue Vortex, it became apparent that Jura can sense / watch what's going on with the other Shinju through their Rinnegan, implying that all of the Shinju are connected to Jura in the same way that Nagato was connected to his 6 Paths of Pain. However, unlike Nagato with his 6 Paths of Pain, the Shinju that Jura is connected to aren't already dead. And thus, if Jura is able to see and sense everything that's going on with the other Shinju through their connected Rinnegan, and it seems to be more of a one-way communication as opposed to a two-way communication. That is to say that Jura can see what's going on with the other Shinju, but the other Shinju probably can't see what's going on with Jura. That seems to imply, much like Nagato's relationship with his 6 Paths of Pain, that in some way or another, Jura is responsible for the creation of the Shinju. And as it's been told to us multiple times in somewhat circuitous ways, that Jura is actually the Ten Tails, this makes a lot of sense. But with all of this in mind, that basically makes Jura the parent of the Shinjus, which is most likely why in chapter 20, when Jura was sitting in the Shinju hideout watching Matsuri fight against Konohamaru, when he realized that Matsuri was going to give into her feelings of love and be betrayed by Konohamaru, he began to cry. But this show of emotion from somebody who's talked at length about the biggest weakness amongst humans being emotions like love was not only perplexing for Jura as a character, but also brings up a lot of perplexing questions like, okay, if Jura can see that Matsuri is in danger and also has the ability to get to her whenever he wants, why isn't he doing that? Is it a plot hole? Or is there an actual answer? Well, I'll tell you right now, I don't think it's a plot hole. And in fact, I think there's 3 really solid ways to explain why Jura didn't pull up to the battle between Matsuri and Konohamaru, or Ryu and the rest of Team 7 2/3. And today, we're gonna break down those 3 very probable explanations. Because today, we're talking Jura is going to let the Shinju die. But before we get to talking about Jura's grander motivations, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. But before we get into all that, today we're gonna talk about the sponsor of today's video, Raycon. Don't you guys just feel like the spring is filled with unrelenting madness? As everybody awakes from their 3-month-long winter hibernation, it feels as though everybody feels the need to screech that they're awake and try to take on the world. The days are longer, everybody's trying to get their summer bodies, they're incentivized at work, everybody wants to hang out all of a sudden, and all the while, I feel as though I'm getting interrupted at every possible turn, which is why I need my everyday earbuds. See, because with the everyday earbuds, active noise cancellation, I can hit the gym and not have to worry about listening to a guy who's been in the gym for a month try to mansplain what a squat looks like to a girl I've seen there for years. But the everyday earbuds also have me covered for work or phone calls, offering me premium audio wherever I go and with whatever I'm doing. On top of that, their new model everyday earbuds are their best model ever, with a 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity that lets you pair to 2 devices at once. And I'll tell you right now, as somebody who sweats at the gym a lot, I've never had a pair of earbuds that is stuck in my ears quite like the everyday earbuds. See, not only are they supremely comfortable, but they're also sweat resistant. So when I'm on runs, the elliptical bike, or even just lifting weights and my ears are drenched with sweat, or I'm moving around, I never have to worry about these things coming out. And I cannot say the same for the other brands. And thus, when I'm at the gym listening to Otaku's Anonymous in my own little zone, I got my active noise cancellation on, and I don't have to worry about anything else in the world. So what are you guys waiting for? Go to buyraycon.com/nchammer23 to get 20% off the best-selling everyday earbuds. Brought to you by Raycon. Also want to make a quick announcement, guys, for those of you who've been looking for the Naruto reaction series here for the past couple of weeks. I've been really busy and also not crushing it mentally. I'm doing better now, kind of. I'm gonna tell you I'm doing better, and maybe it'll just manifest. But now that I have more time, I am getting back in the horse with the Fourth Wall Naruto reaction series, though unfortunately on account of the fact that it just wasn't converting view-wise, that's gonna have to exist behind the Fourth Wall paywall. Unfortunately, in the world of content, you have to follow what works, and the reaction series just wasn't working for this channel. So we're gonna keep posting 1 episode a week on fourth wall for the rest of time. This is technically going to be a 50% downgrade from our 2-episode-a-week promise prior, but I am trying to give more value to the fourth wall members because the reaction series is now going to solely exist on fourth wall. I hope you guys understand. I apologize for the lacking on my part. I'm a human. I post 7 times a week. I'm tired. But if you want to tap back into the Naruto reaction series, you can find my fourth wall link in my description below. On to the video. So, for the last couple of chapters, Jura hasn't played a massive role in the story. And that's not that wild. Jura has played more of the role of a philosopher than a fighter over his time existing in Two Blue Vortex. And the current thing that Jura is philosophizing about is about how humanity has weakened itself and thus slowed its own evolutionary rate by gaining access to intelligence. Intelligence that allowed for the weak to keep on living even though it's the strong that force evolution. Intelligence that gave birth to emotions such as love that hinder humanity's ability to tap back into their animalistic instincts. And thus Jura, over the course of the last 2 chapters, has begun to shift the way in which he talks about humanity, going from a being that was obsessed with humanity and wanted to learn everything about them to a being that supposedly understands the weakness of humanity and how to fix it. But chapter 19 and chapter 20 have done much more than just show us Jura's thoughts on humanity. It's also shown us just how human he is. See, because while in chapter 19, Jura talked about how forced evolution needed to come to pass and how humanity's stagnation in terms of evolution is its biggest weakness, with love being the true reason that humanity is stagnated in terms of evolution. Chapter 20 showed us that while Jura can wax poetically about how he would improve humanity, he too feels love. He too understands emotions, and they are a weakness that is identifiable in him. And this is made increasingly clear in chapter 20 when we see Jura reacting to what's going on with Matsuri in the Land of Wind. See, because when Jura sees that Matsuri is giving into the emotions of love that she feels for Konohamaru, and thus is taking her foot off the proverbial gas pedal of killing and devouring him, he begins to tear up, and he begins to fully cry when he realizes that when Konohamaru identifies part of Moegi in Matsuri, he also takes his foot off the proverbial gas pedal in terms of destroying her with a double Rasengan. Now, while the argument could be made here that the only reason that Jura is crying in this moment is because Matsuri is crying in this moment and the Rinnegan are connected, it seems much more likely to me that Jura is beginning to understand what love is through the medium of the connection he has with his fellow Shinju. But this begs the question that if Jura can truly see everything that's going on with Matsuri and Ryu, and he sees them in any kind of disadvantageous situation, why wouldn't he step in? It's important to remember that both Ryu and Matsuri are covered in claw marks. They're like half their bodies, which is why they're able to summon claw grimes basically at will and shoot them out of their chest at opponents. And every single one of the Shinju, Jura especially, is able to use the ability of the claw marks that allows for them to travel anywhere on Earth. All Jura has to do is quite literally lean back into the cube he's currently leaning against, and he would be able to stick his head, arms, or full body out of Matsuri or Ryu, stepping into their fights and swinging the tide of that fight in their favor substantially. He could literally be on the scene of the fight in a millisecond, and yet he's sitting there in the Shinju hideout watching Matsuri come close to death as Konohamaru tries to eviscerate her with a double Rasengan. And mind you, Jura as the possible creator of the other Shinju, because like we established earlier, if Jura has a connection with the other Shinju through their Rinnegan and is known to be the Ten Tails, then it's not a stretch to say that in some capacity or another that all of the Shinju stem from Jura. And also as an entity that cares about these Shinju so passionately that you will cry when they're betrayed, with all of that in consideration, why would you not step into the battle? Well, like we established earlier, to some it might seem like a plot hole, especially when you consider the fact that Jura almost definitely knows that in somehow or some way Boruto is absolutely watching this fight. And therefore, if hypothetically Jura were to jump through one of the claw marks of Matsuri or Ryu, Boruto, who's watching this fight through Ada, but I don't think he knows that. But then again, he might have a pretty strong inkling that Ada is conveying all this information back to Boruto on account of the fact that the Bug Shinju knows who Ada is, how her Senrigan works, and the fact that she's aligned with Shikamaru and probably therefore by extension Boruto. But assuming that much out of Jura might be a little bit of a stretch. But I don't think it's insane to think that Jura understands that Boruto is most likely watching over Team 7 and 2/3 as they fight in the same way that he's watching over his Shinju. And therefore Jura, who is one of the more intelligent people in the universe, should understand that if he were to step onto this battlefield to help Matsuri and Ryu, that there's a fair chance that Team Boruto would have to make an equal move in turn. As the only person who stands an even remotely good chance of even stalemating Jura is Boruto. And therefore, if Boruto wanted to make sure that Team 7 didn't meet grisly ends at the hands of Jura, he would have to use flying Raijin to get onto the battlefield. And considering the fact that one of Jura's biggest goals outside of consuming Himawari is killing Boruto, why wouldn't Jura pull a move that would for sure pull Boruto out of hiding? I mean, Jura has a legitimate chance to endanger Team 7 here, a move that would 100% allow for him to better accomplish his grander goals, a move that wouldn't give Boruto more time to get on his level of strength, a move that wouldn't allow for Kawaki to get on his level of strength, a move that would basically checkmate Konoha instantaneously. As well, yes, the technically correct thing to do from Boruto here would be watch Team 7 die at the hands of Jura. There's no way he would do that. And thus, the more reasoning you put to Jura's inaction, the more this does seem like a plot hole, right? Well, like with so many plot holes in the Naruto universe, there's possible explanations here. And those three possible explanations are love, evolution, or a stalemate. So like we do with all of these videos, let's start with what I identify as the least likely explanation and work our way to the most likely explanation. And thus our first possible explanation is stalemate. See, I'd like to establish that any of these possible explanations are pretty likely. That is to say that if any of these explanations were used to explain why Jura isn't getting involved in this fight, I would say, yeah, that makes sense, and I accept it. But the stalemate option would certainly be the least interesting way to approach it. See, because the stalemate explanation basically says that Jura understands that if he were to inject himself in this battle against Team 7 2/3 and Ryu and Matsuri, that he would be effectively creating a stalemate between side Konoha and side Shinju. But why, Nick? Didn't you just say earlier that if Jura interjected himself into this fight, that it would immediately swing to the side of the Shinju, and that Mitsuki and Sarada would most likely die because Boruto couldn't step in, because if he stepped in, he'd be putting himself in danger and thus the world in danger? Yes, I did say that. However, that only falls under the possibility that Boruto, when he shows up on the battlefield to fight. See, because in the hypothetical circumstance where Jura is the first to the battlefield before Boruto, it would take Boruto a second to hear that Jura was there. As Ada, who was watching the fight, would have to tell Kashin Koji, and Kashin Koji would have to decide as to whether or not he was going to tell Boruto that Jura showed up. Something that may or may not even actually happen, as Kashin Koji has given Boruto information about the fight very sparingly, because he understands that the more dire he makes the fight between Team 7 2/3 and Ryu and Matsuri seem, the higher likelihood that Boruto will stop listening to him and teleport himself off to join in this battle. And Kashin Koji understands that the second that Boruto joins that fight, Jura joins that fight. And that's not good for anyone. However, in the hypothetical circumstance where Jura joins the battle before Boruto, the most likely scenario that would play out here is that Boruto would teleport to the Land of Wind with the explicit purpose of saving Team 7 2/3. That is to say, he would use the instant teleportation ability of flying Raijin to jump to the Land of Wind once, twice, maybe 3, 4 times, snag individual members of Team 7 2/3, and teleport them back to the broken and worn down Orochimaru's lair that Kashin Koji and Boruto are currently inhabiting. And if Boruto was able to be successful in this endeavor of saving Team 7 2/3 from this battle against the Shinju, that would effectively create a stalemate between side Shinobi and side Shinju, where basically there would be an understanding between both the sides that stated if the Shinju ever got close to consuming the people that they wanted to consume, that Boruto would fly in, abduct them, and bring them back to his lair, which the Shinju don't know the location of. And while this is a possibility, and it wouldn't be the craziest thing of all time for Boruto to do it, as Boruto does have a piece of metal marked with his flying Raijin mark where the battle is currently going down, and thus he could pop onto the battlefield, throw a couple pieces of metal to all the people he wants to save, and then use flying Raijin to instantly teleport them back to his lair. That's not the most interesting solution from a storytelling standpoint, because now anytime Matsuri gets close to Konohamaru, the bug Shinju gets close to Ada, Hadari gets close to Sarada, and so on and so forth, basically all Ada would have to do is tell Boruto where they are, and so long as Boruto had a piece of metal on that person, which he would just put a piece of metal on every single person that was a target of the Shinju, and then he would just snag them away from the Shinju whenever the Shinju was about to consume them. Is it a good defensive strategy? Yes, 100%. Is it a fun story to write? No, not at all. And thus, one could argue that the reason that Jura isn't interfering with this fight is because he understands if he interferes with this fight, so will Boruto. And as both Jura and Boruto have instantaneous ways to get to this fight, his involvement will inevitably create a stalemate of sorts. Kind of the argument that Kashin Koji is making as he tells Boruto to not get involved in this fight, because he knows the second that he gets involved, so does Jura. And Kashin Koji's arguing point is more that Jura will kill Boruto, but I don't really see how Jura kills Boruto if Boruto's just there to teleport a couple of people away. Especially belief he's only focused on Sarada, Mitsuki, and Konohamaru. And while I do believe this theory has some possibility of happening, this theory also doesn't make a whole lot of sense from the perspective of Team Shinobi. Because in the hypothetical circumstance where Boruto does fly onto the scene and teleport all of Team 7 2/3 back to Orochimaru's lair, then the Shinju, who are currently standing by themselves in the Land of Wind, would have unlimited access to Gaara's cocoon, something that Ryu, a controller of Iron Sand, should be able to break down rather easily. And thus, retreat isn't actually a tie in this circumstance, but rather a defeat for Team Shinobi. And thus, a stalemate would actually technically be advantageous to Jura. So with the least likely scenario out of the way here, let's talk about the second most likely scenario, which is kind of tied to the idea of the first most likely scenario, but they are slightly different. And that's because the second most likely scenario that I envision as to why Jura is not interfering with this fight is love. Basically, this idea says that Jura does actually love Ryu and Matsuri as his creations. However, based on what we heard from Jura in chapter 19, specifically in response to the bug Shinju saying, I see, poor humans, but it's got nothing to do with us, talking about the concept of emotion and how it's tied into love, as Jura says in response to the bug Shinju, not so fast, for that isn't the only harmful effect of intelligence. This other concept carries with it the risk of causing even us divine trees serious problems. It's called love. And thus the conclusion of Jura's conversation with the bug Shinju and Hidari in chapter 19 is that human intelligence runs counter to the continuation of evolution. And at the core of problems that comes with human intelligence, and therefore the core of problems that comes with being a divine tree who come from humans and therefore human intelligence, is love. And therefore Jura, who sees the Shinju as the next step in human evolution, a la the mutants in the X-Men universe, is trying to eradicate the things from himself that he identifies as counterintuitive to his own evolution. See, Jura believes that the best way for living intelligent life forms on Earth to evolve is to follow their basic animalistic urges. And love is not one of those urges. And therefore, even though it is made abundantly clear in chapter 20 that Jura does have love for at least Matsuri, Jura may be actively trying to suppress those emotions and therefore not step in this battle because he identifies the love, the kinship, and the empathy he feels for Matsuri as weakness. And therefore, if he wants to be the truly highly evolved being that he believes that he is, he has to be okay with the idea of his own creations fighting their own battles and dying their own deaths. Because if he gives into his love and goes to protect Matsuri and Ryu, then he's really no different from humans. And this idea is solidified by what Jura says later in chapter 19, when he talks about the members of Inashikacho and how he's perplexed by their actions. As he says specifically, each of the Inashikacho trio are accomplished shinobi, but they prioritize Himawari's safety over their own teams. What's shocking is that they were all aware of how foolish that decision was. And thus, this sentiment right here may solidify to us why Jura isn't stepping into this battle. Because while it would objectively be kind of silly for Jura to believe that he's in any danger when fighting against Team 7 2/3, he could simply believe that there's no real reason for him to prioritize Matsuri or Ryu's life over his own. Or maybe he at least believes that he should feel that way. And thus he's trying to convince himself of that belief while sitting there crying about the idea of Matsuri possibly dying. But love isn't the only thing that Jura talks about. He also talks about evolution, which is our third and I believe most likely possible explanation to explain why Jura isn't stepping in this battle. See, Jura actually believes that the Shinju are the final level of evolution. And if the Shinju are to truly be considered the final level of evolution, then they have to find a way to separate themselves from the weaknesses of humanity. However, as Jura is watching Matsuri come face to face with the person that she wants to consume, and therefore the person that she loves, she isn't able to push herself and therefore consume that person, Konohamaru, then fundamentally as the perfect evolutionary being, she's kind of failed. And thus, if Jura has to step in because Matsuri gives in to the feelings of love, then Matsuri will never be able to evolve. And the same could be said for Ryu. Kind of like a parent watching their kid get hurt in a way that was entirely the kid's fault, Jura is allowing Ryu and Matsuri to go through tough times right now so that they can understand what they need to do to actually exist as these perfect evolutionary beings. Ryu needs to understand that the shinobi never have his best intentions in mind. And Matsuri needs to understand that the shinobi are inherently conniving and that they'll try to use her emotionally immature feelings against her to trick her into believing that they're friends, when in actuality they simply want her destroyed and replaced with Moegi. And thus, if Jura were to step in this battle between the Shinju and Team 7 2/3, he'd kind of be stopping a potential parenting moment that could be essential in the evolution of half of his effective children. Now, this explanation does obviously play into the love explanation a little bit as well, right? Because the idea of love and stagnant evolution are tied together when it comes to the mentality of Jura. But I do think Jura is implementing a kind of if they die mentality to the likes of Matsuri and Ryu. Because if they die in combat against shinobi that managed to trick them using their emotions, then they were never the perfect evolutionary beings that Jura wanted them to be in the first place. And with all of that considered, I believe those are the best possible explanations we have for why Jura hasn't interjected himself into this fight yet. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Why do you believe Jura hasn't stepped in this potentially deadly fight for almost half of his fighting force? Tell me about it in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I gotta go record a Naruto reaction video.